Okay, here we go on our first exploration into cosmic watercolor. We are going to be doing a technique that I really use a lot. It's actually something that I do automatic now. I don't even think about it. And it's what I call drop and release. So you're making just tiny movements with your brush using wet paint and a wet surface. And I'll go ahead and show you some of the effects that you can create. So it's like a watery, it almost looks like you're looking into a pool of water, especially when you use these blue tones. Just really unique ways to create different textures and effects in watercolor. This is using drop and release with just water, which we'll do. So just wanted to give you some inspiration here. And also we'll do this project as well. So this technique involves the drop and release, and we're going to do it to create a moon glow. So lots of different things that you can create with just this one technique, but we'll start out just easy, really simple. That's another great thing about it, is it's really simple. So I've got my setup here. This is my water, of course. I have a palette, and this is just one of my ceramic plates. I've squeezed out some paint. I'm using Mauve by Cotman. And the way I get, when I'm using my tube paints, the way I get my palette started here is I use whatever brush, and then I pull. I don't go into this blob of paint, the full thing, because I don't mix up all the color. I pull from the side, so I'm just grabbing paint and pulling it down with water to get the paint activated. And I create myself a little puddle of paint. And the thing about watercolor is the way you control the intensity of the paint is if you want it more intense, you add a little more paint into your water. If you want it less intense, then you just start to add water. So I can create all these different tones with just this puddle here. So I typically start my puddle pretty intense in color, and then if I need it less, I just pull out from it. And so a lot of work happens actually right here on your palette, because as I use this puddle, I'll be using that paint, then I will grab more water and pull down some more and create myself another little puddle. So that's how that works. I also use my paper towel a lot for blotting to help control with water content. So we'll talk about that a lot as well. And then I've also got my Arches 140-pound cold press is what I'm using. And I'm also going to do a pan set next so you can see how I use my pan set. So let's get started. The first part of working wet into wet is that you need to wet your paper. So for most of these videos, I will be speeding up the process of me painting this circle so that you don't have to watch me pushing around water. But I do want to emphasize the importance of this part and just kind of talk about what consistency you're going for. So I'm wetting it to open up the tooth of the paper to allow the paint to flow. And what I'm looking for is the area that I'm painting to be consistent throughout the space and to not have any major puddles. So once I get this all wet, if I pick up my paper and turn it this way or that, no water is going to run outside of that circle. So you can see it's shiny, it's wet, but there's no major puddles anywhere. That's what you're going for. Then I'm using my number 8. You can experiment with brush size. I'm going to grab some of this intense paint. It's very watery. You can see how watery it is. I'm going to load it up. I kind of twirl my brush into the paint, and you touch and release. And when you do that, you can see the paint color will start to flow into the water. You can go back into some of these areas. You can combine some of the areas and really play around with how your planet here wants to look. Also, you can experiment with adding a little less water and a little more paint. So I'm grabbing some paint from my blob there and just a little water. And you can see how that will increase the intensity of color and also give you less of a release. So because your water content is smaller, it won't travel quite as far. And this is a technique that I use when I want to intensify areas. So I just grab more paint and a little less water. So now, because I've got less of an area here to work, I typically will drop down to a lesser brush size. So I've got a 4 here. And I'm just going to start to fill in the rest of my circle. Now, you don't want to put paint everywhere, because we want some of these white areas to come through, and that's what will create this watery effect where it looks like you're just looking into a pool of water. So you don't want to cover those up. You have to use some restraint. So I'm just dropping in a few more. And then what I typically do with any of these that I work on, I use my small brush, I put a little water on it, I dab it off so I've got just a damp brush, and I will start to clean up my edges. Just so the paint will flow, and I'm just using the color that's already in the circle to just manipulate the paint around to the edges. And you can see how I'm dabbing. I'll rinse my brush off, I dab, just kind of pulling color and water out where I want it to be out and manipulating the color that's there just to clean it up a bit. And your small brush is also a great way to really get intense. So I'm grabbing more paint and just a little water, and you can really come in and make some pretty deep, dark areas, which will give visual interest to your surface that you're painting. Also, don't want to overdo that one. So there you go. That is our first technique of drop and release using wet paint, wet paper. And I hope you have fun with this. This is one of my most favorite techniques. Okay, so for this next circle, I'm actually going to be doing pretty much the same thing, but I'm going to use my pan set just so you can see how I use it. Definitely experiment in your own way and figure out what works best for you, because everybody does it a little different. So first I'm just going to clean up this area by just applying some water, and I'm kind of messy with my pan sets, so I'm just going to clean that up a bit. And what I do is I get this set up almost just like I do my plate. So whatever color I'm going to use, I wet it. I just start introducing water into that dry pan there, and I mix it around a bit, and then I twirl my brush in there and I start to create a little puddle in my palette. So almost exactly like I do my plates when I'm using my tubes. So this makes a mess of your palette, but I feel like it gives me more control over my water content. And also, I'll give you a note about cleaning your water. So I'm pretty terrible about it, to tell you the truth. But it is important when you're going from, let's say you're using this purple, you're painting, and then you're done with that part, and you want to move on and you're going to use that yellow. It's kind of important to change your water in between things like that, because purple and yellow kind of make a yucky brown gray, not so great color, and it will affect your painting. So what you can do is have another container of water. That completely confuses me. I've tried it. So like I said, you just kind of have to find your own way and figure out what works best for you. And another tip about pan sets, if you know that you're going to be using a lot of colors at one time, I have a spray bottle and I'll just spray the entire pan just to start activating all the colors instead of having to do them one at a time. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead. This part from here on is pretty much the same. So I'm going to wet my circle. Alrighty, I've got my circle good and wet. So now I'm going to start using my paint. I just twirl. I'm using a number 6, but remember to experiment with brush size. Twirling that into that intense color, drop and release. So you can see this is exactly why I do these planets and I make all these explorations, is because each paint behaves differently in water with each other, and the only way that you can know is use the paint. So I just feel like this is just such a great way to get to know your paint, because you can see how differently this paint reacted than when I did this one. This one tended to stay in one locale. This one is already exploding all over the whole circle. I mean, it would just take over. So we'll also play around with what I call an exploding color, but this is pretty close to what I would consider an exploding color. And it's because there's a certain wetting agent that the manufacturers use in the paint colors, and the only way that you're going to know is by playing around and seeing what happens. I have an ultramarine blue that's by Daniel Smith that is an exploding color, and I have an ultramarine blue by Winsor Newton that is not an exploding color, so you can't even tell by color name. You really just have to experiment and play. So once you see that something is an exploding color, then you know, well, perhaps I need to use a smaller brush. I need to remember that this is going to kind of push and take over. It becomes a bit of a bully. And what it does is it pushes the water out of the way. So this area here will dry much quicker than this area over here because it pushes that water. So now you also know, okay, I've put this paint down, now I have more water supply over here. So all these little things that you get to learn just by doing these experiments. And you can see when I start to add the color into this area now, because there's way more water over here, it behaves a little different. The marks that it makes become drastically different than here. So it's really just about exploring your color and seeing what it can do. This is a truly lovely color. I love this orange. So I've got my circle pretty well filled. I'm going to use my number 2. I rinse, I dab, and I just start to come in and clean up some areas. And remember that I'm just kind of manipulating what's here. And I'm always rinsing and dabbing. There's a little something in there. He can stay there. I'm going to grab a little color just to clean up this edge here, just to make sure that it looks fully covered. And there you go, we've got an orange juice planet. And that's how I use my pan set.